And to this day, I could still hear the squealing of the iron. I can hear the rumbling of the first tower coming down. So being an iron worker and being a person in the construction field, where every day you face some type of hazard or some type of danger. Well, right after we witnessed that collapse, we knew that we wanted to go into the Trade Center site. Meanwhile, everybody else is running from it. And here you got a bunch of guys, your first responders, that are looking to go in.
We would have been better off if EPA had said nothing at all. Because if EPA had said nothing at all, people would have used their common sense. They would have said, looks bad, smells bad, probably shouldn't breathe it in. But EPA said, it's fine, it's safe, we've tested, come back. And everybody came back, and thousands and thousands of people were exposed.
The smell of death. You know, things that we remember that you really don't want to remember.
Here was the worst toxic waste site ever, and no one in government did a thing to protect the hundreds of thousands of people who were there.
We've been abandoned by local, state, federal government.
My name is John Sforezzo. I was a union structural iron worker with Local 361. And I had been a construction worker, an iron worker, for almost 25 years, both outside local and inside locals. And I helped build a lot of New York City skyline. But I was there somewhere between 29 to 32 days. And my first 4 days, sometimes we were there around the clock. We weren't getting paid. We were there as volunteers, utilizing our capacity as iron workers to cut up debris, such as the enormous iron beams and columns, all the massive structures that was still there.
Obviously, 9/11 was a tremendous health disaster, and in my opinion, the response of government at all levels, federal, state, and local government, was not only inadequate, it was dishonest and wrong, and is largely responsible for many, many people getting sick, and many people who will get sick who we haven't seen yet. Within 2 days of the disaster, Christy Todd Whitman started lying about the safety of the air. She said within 2 days that the air was safe to breathe and the water was safe to drink, before we had any adequate data to support such a statement. And she kept lying about it after we had plenty of data that said that it wasn't true.
Christy Todd Whitman is no longer head of the Environmental Protection Agency and is facing 2 different lawsuits. The Justice Department lawyer representing Whitman declined our request for an interview, citing the pending litigation.
But I knew something was drastically wrong. Even while at the Trade Center, I had what most doctors call a World Trade Center cough. And I would start coughing up, most of the time dry, but sometimes sputum that was gray and blackish, sometimes blood even being mixed in, depending upon how hard you were coughing or what you were actually exposed to.
One of the things that did concern us when we investigated the Katrina case and the World Trade Center case is that the public health problems were being minimized by using terms like World Trade Center cough or Katrina cough. In the case of the World Trade Center case, people just weren't coughing. Healthy, young, strapping men can't work anymore. They can't even, many of them can't even climb a set of stairs.
And you will be able to see I had no respiratory problems prior to this. And all of a sudden now, I'm getting repeated lung infections, pneumonia.
We remember the signs all across the city. Iron workers, come quickly, come to the site, we need you. The iron workers rushed down to help work the iron to find the people. And now many of them are sick and there is no health care for them.
I was in such great shape prior to this. I mean, I could climb columns like it was my job for part of my life, a large part of my life. So you have to be very upper body, you have to have a high upper body strength ratio to your mass weight to be able to pull yourself up a column. And to do that continually, repeated floors. And I had no problem doing that whatsoever. Today, I don't even think about going up the stairs that are set on a job site to get to these upper elevations.
I was one of the people who started the agency over 35 years ago, and I started our program for toxic waste, solid waste, and emergency response. For the last 35 years, on and off, I've been the chief investigator on hazardous sites for EPA. When I was the chief investigator for EPA's Ombudsman Office, I investigated the environmental and public health issues related to the World Trade Center attack. We held 2 public hearings that lasted almost 12 hours each in February and then in March of 2002 as part of our investigation. We had testimony from the public. We had testimony from leading scientists from all over the country. And we found that the area was a public health and an environmental catastrophe.
We were one of the first units into the South Tower. Last thing I remember seeing actually was a helicopter trying to go to one of the towers to get people off the tower. Hearing, someone say it was going to blow, and a humongous fireball. It looked like a meteor coming at us.
As Bonnie and several others dashed into a nearby building, an immense wall of debris sealed the entrance.
There was 30 of us buried, alive. And we tried so desperately to get out from where we came in, and it was just worse than concrete. You couldn't budge it. The air was getting so thin because everything was burning, superheated, and people were stopping breathing at that point. And basically said, God, take care of my friends and my family. And I basically closed my eyes and expected to die at that point. And I heard pop, pop, pop. And Lieutenant Tim again, who was in the front, was the police officer that was with us, got to his gun, and it was a miracle that the windows broke.
Bonnie had never had asthma before 9/11, but by the time the day was over, she had had 3 bad asthma attacks.
People just don't understand not being able to catch your breath, not being able to fill your lungs. It's such a horrible, horrible feeling. It feels like someone's crushing your chest.
Well, one of the things we were concerned about when we did the investigation a couple of months after the World Trade Center case was that the heroes, the iron workers, the firefighters, the police, the responders were not being protected, and we were concerned that they would get very sick 1 year, 5 years, 10 years down the line. And I'm sad to report that we are seeing these illnesses now.
I was playing on 3 soccer teams, 3 softball teams, a racquetball league, a paddleball league. I was fishing, I was hiking, I was climbing mountains. I can't even climb upstairs now. I just can't catch my breath. I have chronic sinusitis, bronchitis, asthma. I just got over having pneumonia for the 3rd time. Never had pneumonia before 9/11.
Well, we were horrified on September 18th, 2001, when the head of the EPA, Christy Todd Whitman, got on television and said she was glad to be able to reassure people that the air quality was safe. I remember listening to that and being aghast, just horrified that she could say such a thing. And there were a couple reasons why I had the reaction I did. One, I knew that she didn't have the data to be able to make such a statement, that at that point there was very limited monitoring that had been done.
And we ended up getting pretty close to the site, and I came back and I collected samples from a building that borders the World Trade Center site, and those samples turned out to be 5% asbestos and 90% fiberglass. And we had hooked up with someone that's a leading industrial hygienist, reviewed those figures and kept on giving us warnings about how bad the fiberglass was, the fact that it was pulverized. And we discovered that the National Toxicology Program considers fiberglass to be likely to be carcinogenic. The city came back, and I believe the EPA came back at one time and said, it's just likely to be carcinogenic. That was their defense. And I said, would you likely go down an alleyway if someone's likely to have a knife? And they said no.
Anytime that the media is around, well, how can you attribute this to 9/11? Sorry, Tim Keller was less than a foot from me. Tim Keller's dead. Felix Hernandez, who was out in the field with us, he's dead. These are people that are not old individuals. We're active. We were active. They're dead. They're not coming back.
We would waste potentially thousands of innocent lives of our second class of heroes, perhaps more heroic than the first class, who were heroes by circumstance and by victimization of being the wrong person in the wrong place in the wrong time. These heroes, by job and by inclination, put their heart and souls on the line to try to find a ring, to try to find DNA evidence, to sift through garbage for months and months and months to try to identify human remains, and are now going to lose their lives because of it.
We had data from the Geological Survey and from Cahill about how the toxic stew was the worst they'd ever seen. The University of California, Davis, which was under contract, I think, to the U.S. Geological Survey, put instruments on the roof of this building. Now, this building is about a mile north of Ground Zero, and 3 weeks afterwards, they were detecting all kinds of the worst stew they'd ever seen. Every different contaminant you can think of, from asbestos to lead to manganese to zinc to you name it, all kinds of particulate matter, mercury. They detected a very high pH level, very high alkalinity. They said it was like breathing in Drano. You can imagine what that does to your lungs. And yet, the federal and state governments were telling people it was safe to breathe, it was safe to come back and start working, it was safe to go to Stuyvesant High School right there, it was safe to come back to your apartment.
On September 11th, I was at my office in New Jersey, and I couldn't get back to the city until the next day. I snuck back to my apartment amidst all the security to find out what had happened. And when I did walk into my apartment, it looked like it was snowing. It was just full of dust, and it was hard to breathe in there. Just 2 days later, 2 days after that, I started getting terrible headaches, and I had sore throat and a very deep cough, a very deep, heavy cough. And after I moved back into my apartment, the symptoms persisted, and then a rash appeared on my face and on the tops of my hands. And the fatigue that had hit me was just so severe that, I was dreading walking up and down the subway stairs. It was terrible. After a while, I started experiencing terrible gastrointestinal problems and stomach pains that were just, I was just writhing pain in bed and I could not get out of bed. It was just terrible.
The collapse of the Twin Towers left a thick layer of dust over a large area of lower Manhattan. Contractors hastily gathered up minimum wage workers to clean the interiors of the buildings near Ground Zero. Most of these workers who cleaned apartments and offices wore no masks as they labored in the thick dust, and large numbers are now chronically ill.
My name is Alex Sanchez. I'm 39 years old. This is my son Jack Anthony Sanchez. He's 5 years old. My mother is Iris Ramirez. She's 56 years old. And my baby's godfather, Manuel Checo, and he's 55 years old. The three of us perform cleanup work at cleanup work in the surrounding buildings surrounding Ground Zero. Manuel and myself were there for 6 months. My mother was there for 3 months. We worked 7 days a week. We worked 12, 14-hour days, non-stop. Being so caught up with the tragedy itself, I was not thinking properly, because if it would have been today, I would have never done this job without the proper protection. Our working conditions in Lower Manhattan was devastating. We encountered massive of what is known today, better known as World Trade Center dust. I'm talking about piles of dust this high, just on a table like this. We are extremely sick. Most of our symptoms are chronic. Manuel and myself are developing nodules in our lungs. We suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, gastrointestinal reflux. We get devastating pain in our stomach. I need to take 18 medications on a daily basis, suffering from joint pains.
One of the things that we found in our investigation of the World Trade Center case, and is also occurring in response to the Hurricane Katrina case, is that economics is trumping public health and environmental protection.
I feel extremely, how can I say this, scared, and at times panicky. My mother's helping me raise my son, and not only because of that. This is my mother, I'm her only child. And when I see my mother drain blood from her nose like if it's a faucet, it's extremely scary. When I see my mother that has been hospitalized 3 times already and hooked up to machines, it's not a pretty sight.
We thought that in light of what the World Trade Center events indicated and the remarkable heroism that so many of these volunteers and workers showed, that the workers' compensation insurance companies in New York State would behave differently, that they would be more lenient, less challenging, less willing to fight tooth and nail over each case. But in fact, that turned out not to be the situation. If anything, the rate of controversion, and that's a term that means fighting a case, denying a case, were even higher for World Trade Center responders than they are usually for occupational disease cases, and that's unconscionable.
It took me 3 years to get partially compensated. My mother has not been compensated yet. Frustration, set in immediately when you are in pain, and also you having the bill collector at your door knocking. It's like adding insult to injury. Like I said, we owe this man big time. He carried my family financially and gave us moral support. There came times where I just wanted to end it all. And I don't feel ashamed of saying this, because the walls were closing in on me. But I will look at my son on a daily basis, and that has given me the fight to continue the struggle, to continue to bring awareness, to go to Capitol Hill, to speak to members of Congress. Before 9/11, I was earning roughly $700 a week. Today, I've been partially compensated by workers' comp, and the insurance is paying me $243 a week. Manuel was earning $131 from workers' compensation. Then Manuel lived out of his car because he lost his apartment, couldn't pay his bill. It's only been, 5 years now? And As a day goes by, we feel worse and worse. And we're cranky, and we're anxious, and we're mad, we cry, we're depressed. But it is because we see ourselves deteriorating.
I spoke in Spanish, because I'm bilingual, to hundreds of the Latina day workers who were cleaning up asbestos as instructed with their hands. And they sat in the audience and rolled up their sleeves for me and showed me mutations on their skin, all types of dermatologic problems. You could hear the coughing and wheezing throughout the entire program. And most of these people don't even have health care coverage.
One day in January, after the World Trade Center had at last stopped burning, Kelly decided that she would open her windows for the first time since 9/11.
I opened my windows one night, 1, 2, 3, and what comes out? All this dust out of the window frames, blew right into my apartment. So it was all over the floor again, all over my sofa again. So I sent it away for testing. They detected asbestos in 4 of the 5 samples that I sent.
Since 9/11, the smell of gasoline and diesel fuel is such that I don't get out and even fuel my own vehicles. I don't even want it on my hands because of the odor. Being around the job sites and being around the smell of the diesel and the gasoline, I am so symptomatic to that involvement that I was constantly getting problems with my throat. I would wind up going hoarse, and I would lose my voice sometimes. The next thing you know, from a sore throat, I'd have a chest infection. I get lung infections, then I get pneumonia. And this never, ever happened to me before in my life. Now the smell of smoke actually sickens me, sometimes giving me headaches. I know I can't use any type of cologne or aftershave. I can't take that smell.
I'm Allison Johnson, and I would like to tell you why I decided to make this documentary about the health effects resulting from the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. There will be many other documentaries about 9/11, but this one will undoubtedly be unique in its emphasis upon the development of chemical sensitivity in large numbers of people who were exposed to the toxic clouds of 9/11. What led me to this point? Over a decade of research into the condition known as multiple chemical sensitivity, or MCS. In my book and video on Gulf War syndrome, I documented the existence of chemical sensitivity in a large percentage of the 200,000 veterans of the first Gulf War who are now chronically ill. These soldiers had a prolonged exposure not only to the oil well fires that burned for months in Kuwait, but also to sarin and other nerve agents.
Chemical sensitivities are often acquired after a high dose of devastating exposure to chemicals. This is exactly the situation that developed after the World Trade Center collapse.
I can't be in restaurants because, God forbid, someone has perfume on. I can go into a fit. I can feel nauseous and throw up. My throat can close up. The multiple chemical sensitivity issues that have come from 9/11 have not been addressed.
There's a significant percentage of people in our population who have a hyperreactivity to common environmental chemicals, things like cigarette smoke and paint fumes and solvents and cleaning products, ammonia, various irritating chemicals. And the more extreme of these individuals have what we call multiple chemical sensitivity syndrome. And these are individuals who are so sensitive to these everyday chemicals. They have problems involving multiple organ systems, and in the more extreme cases are actually disabled by their inability to function in ordinary society, where every day of our lives we're exposed to a host of these environmental chemicals.
I can't do normal everyday things. I really have to police myself to make sure that I'm not going to be exposed to, oh my God, gas fumes, the propane for the barbecue, household cleaners. Oh my God, you just might as well pack me up at that point and just send me to the hospital.
I've been tracking the firefighters post 9/11, and what many have told me, and their medical reports have shown that they've become hypersensitive to other chemicals that are out there. They could be fine for a while. They have, respiratory problems. They run 3/4 time, meaning that they're not on active duty, and boom, they'll come across perfume or other chemicals out there, even household cleaning chemicals, and they'll just become immobilized. Some of them just become so sick that they basically can't function on a daily level.
Christine Oliver, an assistant clinical professor at Harvard Medical School, is the former director of occupational and environmental medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital.
So it's very important, if you've experienced something like the September 11th attacks, very important for New Yorkers to understand that in order to prevent development of chemical sensitivity, development of multiple chemical sensitivity, worsening of multiple chemical sensitivity, it's very important that they avoid, to the extent possible, further exposure to irritant chemicals. So they need to be very careful about how they clean their apartments, what apartment they choose to live in, what kind of renovation work they choose to do on their apartment.
After the 9/11 attacks, I wanted to help. I needed to do something before I could return to work. I needed to be involved helping in some way, and I went into the city and volunteered, handing out sandwiches to rescue workers who were coming out from the pile. I returned to work within a couple of weeks after the attacks happened. My office was located about 8 blocks north of the trade towers, and even at that time the dust was so heavy. There was dust all over our office. We were having to clean it. I wore a mask to work at that time because the air was it smelled horrible. It was thick, and it was just, the dust was making it hard to breathe then.
Well, the public was told after the 9/11 catastrophe to just mop up and clean up with a wet, damp rag their own spaces from all these toxics, which of course is a violation of the rules. The public, after a terrorist attack where they're exposed to hazardous materials that can harm them and in fact in some cases be life-threatening, is not required to clean up their own space with a wet mop and broom, but in fact the government's required to clean it up to protect them.
Within the day after 9/11, I started having flu symptoms, and I had a fever and cough, dry eyes, burning eyes, itching skin, dry skin, the sores. I also just had trouble breathing and sleeping, and I had pneumonia and bronchitis and just upper respiratory problems, problems with my throat, sore throat, problems with my voice, and that over the last 4 years has just continued to reoccur. I also have joint and muscle pain that's chronic. Just walking up a flight of stairs or walking a few blocks, 2 to 4 blocks, will exhaust me to the point of needing to rest. I've been seeing doctors for my lungs and sinuses at Mount Sinai Hospital, and they've done pulmonary tests. I've had second and third opinions with pulmonary tests as well that show that my lungs are only functioning at 30% capacity.
Dr. Stephen Levin, co-director of the Mount Sinai Medical School Occupational and Environmental Medicine Clinic, was in charge of a screening program that evaluated over 12,000 sick New Yorkers who had been exposed to World Trade Center toxins.
What came as something of a surprise to us was the high rates of both upper respiratory and lower respiratory problems that were so persistent among people that we saw in our screening program. We did an analysis of about a 10% sample of our 12,000 examinees, and among them, just about half had symptoms involving their lower respiratory system, their chest, shortness of breath, chest tightness, cough, wheezing, and about another half had upper respiratory symptoms, sinusitis, facial pressure, headaches, stuffy nose, postnasal drip, the kind of classic symptoms of sinusitis.
I'm very sensitive to chemical smells, even to the point of having to change, not wear perfume or change body lotions or shampoo. These are some of my paintings that I was working on in, I think, 2000 or 2001, before 9/11. And since then, even though I've been home and I've been resting and I've only been able to work part-time, I can't paint right now because I'm too sensitive to even acrylic paint, even water-based paint. I'm too sensitive to it. I'm too sensitive to my markers, to use markers for illustration and drawing. So my painting studio area has turned into a medical billing station, basically. The apartment building that I live in, they keep it very clean, which is wonderful. Except for me, when I go into the elevator or the halls, which don't have a lot of ventilation, the chemicals that they use to clean, ammonia or solvents, whatever it is, I can barely breathe. I actually try to hold my breath going down in the elevator.
We have problems with getting into places where there's lots of chemicals or heavy perfume. Our lungs is not there no more.
One of the things that we uncovered at EPA doing investigations of releases of hazardous material is large numbers of people where there are releases start to develop what we call chemical sensitivity. And so we're seeing health effects to the public around hazardous sites like the World Trade Center a year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, where people are now sensitive to chemicals. A little bit of perfume, for example, which would not affect anybody, can make people deathly ill.
When I walk down the sidewalk and somebody's smoking, I could just scream. Like I just can't stand the smell anymore. Someone who's wearing too much cologne, I have to get away from them.
Another striking thing is that many of our patients are much more reactive to strong odors than they were before. Not always with exactly the same kind of reaction that they'll experience when they're exposed to cigarette smoke or bus exhaust, but they notice these odors more and find themselves reacting physically unpleasantly to these odors in ways they never did before. I have patients who cannot walk into a department store cosmetic area without experiencing shortness of breath and chest tightness in ways they never did before. I have patients who cannot get on an elevator where someone is wearing strong perfume or cologne without experiencing fairly intense respiratory reactions. We don't always understand why this is so, but it is extremely commonly reported among our World Trade Center responders.
I'm the New York City executive for the Sierra Club. I work out of the field office of the Sierra Club in New York City. And I've had about 25 years of experience in environmental law and policy. I did a lot of investigation of ground zero pollution issues and how the federal government responded, produced a report that was about 200 pages long, depending on how it's printed. And I have some experience in analyzing things like incineration and demolition. I had a pretty good idea of what was in that cloud of smoke coming out of those towers. And I think that the EPA did. In fact, I know that the EPA did too. I think they had a very, very good idea of what was in that cloud. They should have known, and I believe did know, that there would be asbestos, lead, cadmium, chromium, a whole range of chemicals that cause cancer and also affect the human immune system, and of course the respiratory system.
Physicians in our country are not trained in occupational medicine. I think they're all 2 or 3 classroom hours devoted in 4 years of medical school to occupational and environmental illness. So one can hardly blame well-intentioned doctors who are seeing patients who are complaining of respiratory problems from their World Trade Center exposures if the doctors didn't know how to understand this and evaluate it. And many of our patients told us that they went to doctor after doctor, received course of antibiotics after course of antibiotics for what was not an infection. It was in fact a chemical burn.
And we helped for 8, 9, 10 days try to recover what we thought might be people that were alive. Well, when I was in the police academy in 1988, we had a hazmat procedure then. You know, they've always had hazmat procedures. So how come the procedure was, here's a paper mask and a shovel, have a good day? You know, and then they say, well, they gave us a good mask. No, they didn't give us a good mask. The people that took the good mask were on the perimeter, all the self-important people were running around 9 blocks away with all this stuff on their faces, and they look like the super. I played in the Bronx Football League at the age of 41, all right? I have 15 interceptions. Mine led the league, I think it did. And a year and a half later, I can't walk up a flight of stairs. That's sad. So I must have just gotten old all of a sudden. You know, all of a sudden I played 20 plus years of football, and all of a sudden I can't do anything. I can't walk down a hill without like stopping and having to breathe. But when you're so sensitive to the chemicals, it's like the chemicals to clean the carpet, everything you can think of. The guy comes in to clean our office, I'm gone.
While the EPA contains thousands of dedicated scientists who are career employees, the head of the agency, Christy Todd Whitman, was appointed by the White House. The EPA's own Inspector General issued a report in 2003 that was critical of Whitman's actions after 9/11. Hugh Kaufman, the chief investigator for the EPA's Office of the Ombudsman, had this to say about Whitman's actions.
Within a couple of days after the World Trade Center towers came down, EPA, and particularly the administrator of EPA, Christy Todd Whitman, went on national television and told the public that the air was safe to breathe and everything was fine, and people were rushed back to Lower Manhattan, asked to clean their own spaces, and there was a public health and environmental threat that occurred for many, many months subsequent to the collapse of the World Trade Towers. But as far as EPA was telling the public, everything was safe. So Christy Todd Whitman lied to the public about the safety, and that saved, among other groups, the insurance companies that insured people who live, work, go to school down there, that saved those insurance companies billions and billions of dollars.
By contrast, the financial position of those whose health was ruined by the toxic clouds is indeed grim.
At this point, I'm about $80,000 in debt after selling my home, my car, moving into a smaller apartment, getting rid of my painting studio that I had in Long Island City.
What I used to make in a day, I have to live on for a week now.
I was making 60 grand or better. I'm 60 grand in the hole.
Marjorie Clark is an international expert in the field of incineration.
By the time 9/11 happened, well, I certainly knew that there was something horrendous going on downtown in terms of incineration. Obviously, the air was not getting into the little pockets, and so you were having really awful conditions, pyrolysis conditions, not true combustion conditions. So as a result, I was thinking, my God, this is a dioxin factory. Everything that was being incinerated there was not being completely combusted. So you were probably getting all kinds of nasty substances coming out.
Initially, there's a strong suspicion that many of us had that this was a decision, this pronouncement about the safety of air quality down there, that was based less on public health and less on monitoring data than a desire to get Lower Manhattan running economically. Get Wall Street going, get the stock exchange going. I mean, there was a lot of talk about that. It wasn't until later that we had confirmation that, lo and behold, this really was a strong influence on the EPA's pronouncements, because it turned out that the Council on Environmental Quality, the president's own sub-cabinet level group in the White House, had influenced what the EPA was going to say. In fact, the EPA had been preparing to issue a cautionary message saying, we're not sure what's going on down here, but you ought to be careful because this, in fact, may be a toxic environment. What the Council on Environmental Quality said to the EPA was, emphasize reassurance, de-emphasize hazard. And so the EPA reversed itself.
Now, I don't care how important the economy is. I don't sacrifice my one-year-old child's brain to it. There was lead in that dust. It can cause permanent brain damage, so can mercury. You know, what on earth were they thinking in telling all of these families that they could come back?
In 2002, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation offered grants to people to lure them back in, like the Pied Piper. These grants were especially large if you brought in children and signed a lease for 2 years.
I'm an attorney with the United States Securities and Exchange Commission and a union steward. On September 11, 2001, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission's offices were located at 7 World Trade, and they were destroyed by fire that afternoon. The SEC then leased new space here on Broadway, and our people who had not been exposed, most of them, to World Trade Center contamination on the day of the attacks, they had been evacuated safely without exposure because we were evacuated to the north and the wind was blowing south. Came to work at this building. Most of us immediately fell ill. 2 days after I came to work at this building in fine health, I woke up at night choking with asthma, and ever since then, I've been sick. Ever since then, I've suffered from continuous reactive airway disorder, as diagnosed by the experts at Mount Sinai, the doctors who have seen 10,000 victims of these attacks. Ever since then, I've suffered from recurrent attacks of bronchitis, and in the worst situation, the bronchitis exacerbated into pneumonia, and I had to be rushed to the hospital with a fever of over 104. This is just an example of what life in southern Manhattan is like because of the total failure of the American government to clean up the contamination left behind when the World Trade Center was destroyed.
Large numbers of residences and office buildings in Lower Manhattan remain contaminated by World Trade Center dust. Toxic dust remains in many heating and air conditioning ducts, recontaminating those units that have been cleaned. In 2003, the EPA appointed a panel of experts to advise it on a plan to clean up buildings in Lower Manhattan. In the fall of 2005, after over a year of wrangling, the EPA dismissed the panel.
We're looking forward not only to the suffering of the 10,000 people who have already been harmed by this, who already have respiratory symptoms and other symptoms, but eventually, in 15 years, to a new tidal wave of untreatable fatal lung cancer, mesothelioma, because that is what this asbestos causes. And we are going to have this epidemic, and the only question is, how bad is it going to be? Every year that we delay cleaning up the asbestos means the forthcoming epidemic is that much worse.
So it's too late to do any number of people now, how many God knows, are doomed to come down with these terrible diseases because of our negligence up until this point. And any number of other people will come down with these terrible diseases because we don't clean it up now. So we must continue the fight to clean this up in order to save lives. This could go on for 30, 40, 50, 100 years. People could be continuing to breathe this in if we don't clean it up. And it's nothing short of criminal negligence. Criminal negligence, that we are condemning people to early deaths by not cleaning it up properly.
somebody yelled, the tower, and I looked up, and that's when the first tower, you could hear the rumbling, started to fall. So I told everyone to take cover in the bank, and the next thing you know, we were being hit with debris, and on top of it, think of somebody taking a big bucket of toxic dirt and dumping it down your throat at the same time. So not only could you not see, you could not breathe at all. People were screaming. I remember one lady in the bank was holding me so tight, I thought she was going to choke me to death just out of fear, and we thought we were going to be dead.
Marvin suffered a stroke only 5 months after 9/11, but recovered sufficiently to return to work. Unfortunately, the bad asthma and other health problems that he developed post 9/11 have forced him to take early retirement at a great financial loss. Like so many other responders who worked in the horrific Ground Zero landscape strewn with blood and body parts, he also suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. He recently testified to a congressional committee investigating 9/11 health problems.
No proper warnings, didn't have proper safety equipment for the rescue and recovery workers. You know, we really sacrificed a generation of rescue and recovery workers at Ground Zero. And I really believe that there was a political reason for that. I don't think that the government wanted people to be decked out in spacesuits on Ground Zero while stockbrokers and parents with kids in strollers were walking just a block away.
This was an ice hockey coach of my local high school team where all 3 of my children were going to high school. And I didn't know that his day job was being a detective in the New York City Police Department. And because the hockey team was having such a great year, people were tragedized that he couldn't make it to the finals because he had leukemia. And they and he thought that the leukemia had something to do with the fact that he spent 5 months 24/7 at the World Trade Center and at Fresh Kills. And his doctor said quite often people get leukemia from benzene poisoning. Did he have any exposure to benzene? And that's when I met him. It started with Detective John Walcott. When the hockey coach came to me and we looked into the 91,000 liters of jet fuel that were lying burning on the ground, realizing it might have been one of the largest benzene spills in history, and seeing the relationship causally between that and leukemia, we started getting concerned that although the latency periods were slightly quicker than would have been normal under prior studies, maybe with some of the other toxins, more could have been involved. Then John had a good friend who also lived near me, who was a detective by the name of Richard Volpe, whose kidneys were collapsing. Also a young man in his 30s, and his doctors were saying that it was from a toxic exposure and they weren't sure what to do for him. Then he had a friend, and then there was some newspaper articles and some radio. Next thing I knew, I had 20 or 30 or 40 people. The next thing I knew, my phone didn't stop ringing. Then I had 200, then 400, now it's over 6,000, and the phone rings and the emails come in every day by the dozens of more people who are getting sick who need help. The Fresh Kills site contained tons and tons of garbage, of toxic waste, where everyone again was working without any protection. People like Detective Walcott and Detective Volpe were there for months unprotected. They said that when the snow came down in the freezing weather, nothing would stick to the ground. It would just sparkle in the mercury and all the other toxins that were there that they were breathing. And now Detective Walcott has leukemia and Detective Volpe has collapsed kidneys. In the same unit working together in the same place, both previously tremendously healthy men in their 30s.
When you have a very hot fire, you get very, very tiny particles that can get down deep into the lungs and lodge there and stay there and wreak havoc with your system. Those tiny particles will contain a lot of toxic chemicals because a lot of toxic fumes will attach to those particles.
Studies have shown that following the September 11th attacks, a significant amount of fine particulate matter, particles less than 2.5 micron in diameter, which are respirable, were released into the air. Now, what it means when you say that particles are respirable is that they make their way down into the lungs. Once these fine particles reach the lungs, they can be absorbed into the bloodstream and distributed to the rest of the body.
For some people who already had multiple chemical sensitivity before 9/11, this huge new exposure was particularly devastating. Before she developed MCS at age 32, Jen Duncan had a lot going for her in life. She had degrees from MIT and NYU. She had excellent and creative jobs, and she enjoyed activities like dance and yoga and African drumming.
I had developed chemical sensitivity prior to 9/11. The office building where I worked was doing renovations, and after prolonged exposure over several weeks in a poorly ventilated area to a number of those chemicals, I had a number of strange symptoms and unusual things that were going on that then later on we realized was developed into multiple chemical sensitivity and other chemical injury symptoms. After 9/11, with all the exposure of the smoke and the fumes blowing over from Manhattan into Brooklyn, I definitely experienced exacerbation and got even more debilitated. And being exposed just to cologne, or if I was out around traffic or somebody smoking a cigarette, that it would make me disintegrate and have the disorientation and the trouble breathing and the great pain, joint pain. Well, you can just imagine after 9/11, it definitely exacerbated all of that, and was a real struggle and a challenge. And like I said, it was after that point when I became completely housebound. It was like that for long blocks of time, and particularly it would be really bad after they would spray for the West Nile virus.
It's inevitable that a percentage of the population will develop chemical sensitivity in a situation where there's widespread exposure to toxic chemicals like the World Trade Center disaster. Given that sensitivity that inevitably develops, we really need to think twice about the broadcasting of chemicals like pesticides in the environment. Even in a case with, say, West Nile virus, because of the sensitivity, which must be factored in, the cure may be worse than the disease, and in fact is worse than the disease.
I have dyslexia sometimes now. Like I always check and double check. I would write an envelope and it would be returned because I mix up numbers. I never had a problem with numbers before. I did calculus and differential equations, and if somebody asks me numbers or to spell something, it's really hard. Sometimes it helps me. I know I knew a little sign language before, so I'll usually spell out just to help me get something physical to get the numbers or letters out. Sorry, I'm getting fatigued, so I'm trying to just ride the waves and hold my energy together to get through.
Believe it or not, that was Jen on one of her good days. We had also filmed her the day after a doctor's appointment. Jen told us that exposure to several air fresheners and diesel fumes in the private ambulance that transported her had caused this temporary but sharp decline in her condition.
Funding for research in chemical sensitivity in this country does not measure up to the size of the health problem, the public health problem that it is. Japan does a much better job than we do in studying this problem and making funds available for serious researchers. I believe the reason that we haven't seen more research funding is political rather than scientific. There are commercial interests, the manufacturers of consumer products that pollute the air that we breathe, and the workers' comp insurance companies, and others that perceive that if we knew more about this problem, they would be liable for people suffering. And frankly, they don't want it studied.
Newspaper reporters often refer to MCS, or multiple chemical sensitivity, as a rare condition, but this is hardly the case. In 2004, the Archives of Environmental Health published a national MCS prevalence study by Stan Kress and N. Steinemann. The researchers reported that 2.5% of the respondents in a national random phone survey reported that they had been diagnosed with MCS. This suggests that over 7 million Americans are suffering from multiple chemical sensitivity.
It's torture. You know, some days you wish you died that day. Because living, I don't call this living. Part of me died 9/11. I will never get that back. And I've been existing day in, day out.
I felt like, my gosh, we failed to protect these workers to start with, but having failed to protect them and spending money to monitor, to spend no money to heal them and make them better, extend their life, have them treated as if it's their fault. So nothing very good that I can say about how we've handled this issue.
We become different people. A lot of us, we explain it sometimes as if you were dead, it would have been a final saving grace in some respects. But being left alive and symptomatic from what you experienced leaves you a hollow shell of an individual now. And you feel that way because it's not the same you.